I'm going to begin by passing it over to Keith Parker, who I think is an amazing Indigenous scientist and person and member of our communities. I'm going to allow him to introduce himself to do his presentation, and then I'll come back to introduce our second panelist. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I look forward to our discussion and questions. Just a reminder, please put any questions that you have into the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And Keith, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Can everyone see me? I hope so. So I really appreciate the introduction, very much so. Thank you very much. And I really just want to thank all of the panelists to allow me to come here and present. I feel very privileged to be a part of not only Save California Salmon, but also all of the work that's being done in Indigenous country, throughout the West Coast of the United States to save Pacific salmon, and in fact, all anadromous fish, sturgeon and Pacific lamprey and steelhead and eulachon and all the other fish that West Coast native tribes have depended on since time immemorial. So thank you very much. And I don't have a lot of time and we started a little late, so I'm just going to jump right into my presentation. Give me just a second here. Okay, somebody give me a thumbs up or some indication that you guys can see all this?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. So again, my name is Keith Parker and I'm a senior biologist with the Yurok tribe of Northern California. That doesn't mean that I'm a senior, so it just means I'm a senior biologist. So I have a ways to go. So even though I got the gray hairs coming in. So a little bit about me. I am Yurok, Hupa, Karuk, and Tolowa, but I'm an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe, and I reside on the Yurok reservation, and I'm also a tribal biologist for my reservation. And when I was in graduate school at Humboldt State, after getting my bachelor's degree at Humboldt State, I conducted all of my thesis research on a tribal trust fish species known as Pacific lamprey. But Native Americans, we call those eels, right? Even though they're not a true eel, they don't have an opposable jaw and all of that, but that's what we call them. And I was really blessed by the creator to be fully funded by the National Science Foundation and also the Switzer Fellowship. So I'm an NSF fellow and the Switzer Fellowship, which is an incredible environmental group, which I would encourage all of you to look them up online and be part of what they're doing. So this is where I work a lot. My office is actually right down here at the mouth of the river, the Klamath River, which some of you know culminates about 300 miles of river pathway that begins up in Oregon. And actually really the headwaters of the Klamath, the Wood, the Williamson, and the Sprague rivers go all the way over almost to Idaho, right? It's part of even the Crater Lake drainage system. So my work that I do now as a fisheries biologist for my tribe, it merges the paradigms of like traditional ecological knowledge with modern science. So for me, I push back against the false narrative that science is not related to social justice. So for me, fish recovery is like simultaneously a social justice issue and a scientific issue, and I can't separate the two. And in my opinion, the Yurok, Hupa, Karuk, the Klamath River Basin tribes, they're leaders on both fronts. Because for us, for river people, from a TEK perspective, the species loss that we're seeing not only represents a loss of biodiversity, but it's a loss of cultural heritage as well, okay? And so increasing the abundance of Klamath River fish is really my calling, right? Like I've had jobs. I even had a couple careers in my younger days. But for me, what I do now is really my calling, because for our people, the river is our grocery store. In fact, if anybody's familiar with Klamath, the closest grocery store is actually 25 miles away. And for the upriver or downriver people, depending on where you're at, right? You know, you look at Johnson or Witchpeck, you know, there's no grocery store for even a further distance. So since time immemorial, we've depended upon the Klamath River to be like the blood that flows through our veins, you know, depending on Chinook, coho, sturgeon, steelhead, eels, eulachon. And so these are all pictures from my personal photos of fish that I harvest and how I process them, you know, on a regular basis. And so I think it's just really important to talk about food sovereignty for a minute. You know, we all know that, you know, the fish are in massive decline along all the West Coast rivers, including the Klamath River. And this massive destruction of the Klamath River basin ecosystems, it's really impacted the food security and the food sovereignty of Klamath River people. And I think it was Valerie Segrest of the Muckleshoot tribe who made this statement that the right of a community to define its own diet and shape its own food system, you know, with access to all historical food, that is food sovereignty. And I really want to expand upon that because at the core of tribal sovereignty is food sovereignty, right? Because food for us, and for really, you know, any culture throughout the globe that you go to, it's a foundational part of our culture because our food feeds much more than our physical bodies. These traditional foods that we've been harvesting, you know, since before the last ice age, they feed our spirits. And that's because these foods represent our living link with the land. And like everyone, we are truly what we eat, and we eat the earth. We eat the river, right? And, you know, from the traditional worldview, living resources and culture are singular, right? They're intertwined with nature. Food, language, art, ceremony, they all evolve synchronously, right? Not independently. And when you remove any one of those from the equation, it's going to have really deleterious impacts on all of the other things. For instance, a lot of the natural foods that we've seen go away that are part of our traditional diet, things on this page like sturgeon or sturgeon eggs, you know, or eulachon or salmon, we've seen huge health impacts, right? We have like 1,000% the national average of diabetes and obesity and mental health disease, all of that. You know, substituting it with processed flours and sugars is not a good substitute. So one of the fish that's near and dear to my heart, besides salmon, are also Pacific lamprey. And I just really want to hit on that the cultural and subsistence importance of Pacific lamprey or eels can't be overstated. Some of the things that people don't realize about lamprey, I'll get into in another page, but the biggest thing about them is it provides Klamath River people with food during the winter months when salmon were unavailable. And that's not by default, that's by design by the creator, right? So during the coldest time of the year, when our people needed to pack on body weight and stay warm, here come these lamprey, which are much higher in lipid content than salmonids that are available for us to harvest. So why are Pacific lamprey important? Let's just run over these really quick. A lot of people don't realize that the Klamath River Basin supports the highest number of lamprey species in the world. Some of them are only found here, like the Miller Lake lamprey and the Klamath similis. Historically, it's believed that Pacific lamprey were the largest fish biomass of any fish in the Klamath River, right? In fact, our traditional stories tell us that when lamprey would return and spawn and die and their bodies would begin breaking down in the upriver portion, that people would leave the river for days or a week because of the smell and the change of water color, because there are literally millions of them that were just, you know, literally rotting in the river. They also serve as a buffer species to protect salmon. This is a really important thing, and this is understated. One more piece of the pie to, so to speak, of salmon restoration is let's increase our lamprey populations, because historically marine mammals prefer to eat lamprey. They're scaleless, they're slimy, they can swallow them whole, and they're really easy to catch because they're slow, you know, unguliform type swimmers. And they give them higher lipid content. They get more bang for their buck, less energy to catch them, and they actually get higher lipid content. For instance, a salmon, depending on species, has about 1.4 to 3 kilocalories per gram of body weight. An eel has about 6 kilocalories per gram of body weight. So, much higher lipid content. And, not just lamprey, but all the anadromous fish that spawn and die in the Klamath River Basin contribute essential biomass to these upriver headwater streams. And again, something that's often understated and really should be overstated is that connectivity between the headwater streams and the marine environment. There's a reason why all of the fish leave rivers and go out into the ocean, because in the ocean, there's a lot of great things to eat. And it's just packed with marine-derived micronutrients, right? The ocean supports Mother Earth, right? And then all these fish come back and they spawn and they die. And in their flesh, they're carrying all of those marine-derived nutrients that they've bioaccumulated over their time out there. And a lot of different mammals, right? And mink and fishers and river otters, they drag those fish into the forest and they consume them partially. And then a lot of it is absorbed into the ecosystem. And we know several decades ago that marine-derived phosphorus was identified in redwood tree core samples. And they were like, how are we getting phosphorus, marine-derived phosphorus, hundreds of miles inland oftentimes? And that's because, in essence, these trees are made of fish, right? And it's not by accident, right? It's by design that you have redwood trees, some of the oldest living things on the planet. Some of them that I'm looking out my window have been here since before Christ walked the earth. It's not by accident that they grow overlap where you have these anadromous fish like salmon and lamprey and sturgeon that spawn and die every year. It's fish fertilizer every single year. And those riparian plants that are at those headwater streams that get this fish fertilizer, they grow out over these headwater streams and it creates shade on the water, right? So then when juvenile salmon come out, they have cooler water. All of those leaves that are providing that shade, they become the home for terrestrial insects. And many of those insects fall off into the water and feed juvenile salmon. All of the root systems that's in the bank on this plant growth, that creates bank stability, so you have less erosion into the salmon spawning beds, right? And then there's the ripple effect, the ecosystem connectivity, right? So if you have more plants, you have more deer because there's more plants to eat. If you have more deer, you have more mountain lion, right? So my point in all of that is that salmon, sturgeon, lamprey, and other fish, they've been keystone cultural species for thousands of years, right? And really that relationship and the ability to maintain that relationship, it exemplifies like the Klamath Basin tribe's ability to maintain a sustainable fishery. And it really illustrates the depth of knowledge that tribes possess, right? Our traditional ecological knowledge regarding fish management, because it's only been in the last 100 years that we've done more damage than in the previous history of human beings, right? So cultural importance, that's one of my ancestors there. He was my great uncle there. He's got over probably 1,000 eels behind him with a sturgeon that they collect, and then they would be dried and put away down in the lower right-hand corner of some of the eels that are mine that end up going in the smokehouse, and then I can them after that. So let's talk a little bit though about the traditional ecological knowledge, compare and contrast. So, we can view the world as something to exploit, right? Boy, do we know that, right? Let's dam it, frack it, mine it, extract it. Or we can see it as something to protect, right? Let's put it in a national park. Let's make it a wilderness area. Don't let human beings in. The problem with both of those paradigms is that humans are considered separate from nature, that we are not part of nature. And both of those have dominion over nature. Whereas TEK is a different perspective, right? It's often how we do things, right? It's how you fish with a dip net or how you gather basket materials, right? Cultural burning. And so, like I said earlier, there's the singularity that we view where human beings are completely intertwined with humanity, and then all of this stuff evolves synchronously. And that's a key thing, right? And I just really want to point out too, a lot of times traditional does not mean that it's not adaptive. TEK evolves also. So don't get too caught up, just like my title, senior biologist. Okay, I'm still relatively young, depending on how old you are, I guess. And so for instance, this TEK relationship, right? Just an example, what we exhale right now, carbon dioxide, the redwood tree breathes, right? And what the redwood tree exhales, oxygen, is what humans breathe. And it's just one example of like part of TEK, one of those relationships that is fundamental to the survival of like redwood trees and human beings. And I just really want to point that out. And if you start looking around, you'll find many, many other relationships like that. How much time do I have? Sorry.
Yeah, I would say about 5 or 6 more minutes.
Oh, good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the work that I do as a tribal scientist. And I think this is really key that I would really like to convey to people, that maybe people that are, don't understand fully what tribal scientists, the extra steps that we have to go through. Every day throughout the day, I have to put different hats on, so to speak, depending on my audience. I may get off a call with a NOAA Fisheries committee, and I'm using my more contemporary academic hat. And then maybe an hour later, I'm in a meeting with the tribal council, and I have to use more of my TEK hat. But, really the way I viewed it is I took these 3 circles, and if I take my traditional ecological knowledge, and I overlap that with like my place-based identity, and I overlap that with like my Western science training, really where those 3 overlap is where traditional scientists such as myself work on a daily basis. And I can tell you it's often very difficult to bridge the gaps that exist between these different spheres of influence. And I think that's one thing that makes TEK so valuable, is that we bring a completely different, fresh approach to the table at a lot of the meetings with, federal and state agencies. And in essence, we can speak, these different languages, as it were. So just to segue into some of the work that I do, I think Regina had mentioned, maybe just touch base on some of the work that I do that helped illustrate what I just talked about, the combining of TEK and contemporary science. So I was very fortunate during my graduate degree. This was me on my way down to do some sampling. I got followed by a National Geographic Nat Geo crew who used a drone on my way down to my work site. And I worked on Pacific lamprey, again, extremely important part of the puzzle of salmon restoration, as I touched on earlier. And these lamprey swim right up the edges of the river on an outgoing tide, which makes them vulnerable to harvest. And then I was there with a traditional eel hook, as you can see in the bottom of the screen there. This one has abalone inlay in it that a lot of Yurok and Humboldt, Karuk and other men make to catch these eels. And this was one batch of eels that I harvested in a day for my research for Humboldt State research for my master's thesis. And I'm not going to get too caught up in these slides. I just going to kind of run through them quick since I'm short on time and I'm not, giving a full presentation. But this is just some of the results that I had. I was able to, work with these fish and get a lot of great bio data. Over a whole year, I collected about 250 samples, and I started finding all types of really cool patterns between not only their phenotype, which is what they look like, what they weigh, what sex they are, the mass of their eggs. But I was really blessed to be able to work with the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission collaboratively, and they invited me up to their high throughput genetics lab in Idaho, and I lived there for a summer, and I was able to genotype all of those tribal trust fish species, these lamprey that I collected using a high throughput technique. And then ultimately, I won't bore you with all this, but there was all this really cool results that we found for genetic and phenotype and genotype connectivity. And ultimately, what I found is I was very blessed to be able to discover 2 new subspecies of Pacific lamprey that we didn't know existed. Quite frankly, there's not a lot of efforts being put into lamprey because they're not important commercially and they're not important to sportsmen. They're important to basically tribal members, right? So what was interesting about my work, though, is that one of the first times in like fisheries literature, this was published, these peer review papers, that they allowed me, I hate to use the word allowed me, but my committee suggested it, and then it was accepted by by molecular ecology. I used traditional Yurok words to name these 2 new subspecies of fish. And as most of you know, in science, there's typically a very set protocol of how you name things. So forevermore, these 2 new subspecies of fish that I discovered the genes that make them unique, much like spring and fall Chinook, will forever have Yurok words assigned to them in the literature. And already what's really cool is I'm, getting correspondence from people that are actually using the words tuwal, which means ocean in Yurok, for the ocean maturing fish, and keween, which is the Yurok word for eels, for the river maturing fish. And so I think this was an incredible opportunity to illustrate, the combining of traditional knowledge. So I knew how to catch these fish. I knew where to go. I knew when they ran, right? And then combining that with my academic training at Humboldt State University and becoming, an emerging geneticist. And so I was really pleased by the outcome of that. So how am I doing on time?
You got just 1 more minute.
Okay. So in closing, I just want to say that, as a biologist for the tribe and the Harvest Management Division, there's some graphs here I just want to show. This really illustrates why we all need to continue to work so hard. This is a spring salmon returns up through last year. Last year on the South Fork Trinity, only 26 spring Chinook were counted in snorkel surveys, 181 on the Salmon River. These are historically our big, wild spring Chinook return streams. And as you can see, since 2010 or 12, it's just been a roller coaster ride down, right? And when you look at some of the other documents, like for Pacific lamprey, there's been a 98% reduction in their population size. Historically, steelhead are down 67%, coho, Chinook here, fall run 92 to 90%, 6% reduction. Spring run Chinook, only 2% of the historical runs are still here. And my point is that, we all have a lot of work to do still, and it's really important that we work collaboratively with tribal and non-tribal entities to try to fix these problems. And of course, one of the huge ones is dam removal. Let's get these dams down so that, we don't have to see this green water anymore. And I just would implore all the young students that are out there listening right now that the future is yours. You're the future biologists. You're the future scientists, that not only for the Klamath River, but for all the rivers on the globe that are going to need your help. Okay. So thank you.
I want to take a moment to thank Keith for the amazing work that he has been doing and the wonderful presentation. I think that's a good way, being in that space just now. I feel like I like to kind of balance things out. I think that was a really well put together, well thought of presentation. I have a presentation, but I think for the sake of my own sanity, I'm trying to step away from the academic way of considering, life and reality. I'm just going to kind of have a candid conversation about, traditional ecological knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. And I really like the PowerPoint that, the images that Keith had showed us, but I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I do, I will say that my name is Charlie Reed, Hoopa Yurok Karuk person, also a World Renewal ceremonial participant for Karuk people up at Enam. So that's kind of a couple of the hats that I wear. Recently, in 2019, graduated from Humboldt State in the Native American Studies Department, and I'm currently in the Environment and Community Social Science program at Humboldt State. Another title that I take a lot of pride in is being a first-time father in this last year to Ishaha, and I also became a husband to my wife Danielle. So those are some of the things that I take a lot of pride in being. They very much play a role in who I am and how I navigate the world. But some of that comes from my connectedness to my community. Grew up in Summers Bar, California, Cudamine, right there at the confluence of the Salmon River. And so, kind of tying it back to Keith's image and data that he had presented with the low numbers, 124 in the salmon, and I think he said 80 something in the South Fork Trinity, like some of the last wild spring chinook salmon to be around. So it's disheartening, to know that that's our reality, but that it's also trying to channel that energy into some type of motivation to make sure that we catch it while we still can. We can kind of fix things while we still can, and like you said too, just kind of starting with the dam removal process. And I never thought I would be alive to see the dams come down, but the fact that there's even a conversation of that coming down makes me feel a little better. I think we need to have a little bit more urgency with it, but that's just kind of the way things go in this bureaucratic state that we're in. So part of the research that I've been doing here at Humboldt State in my graduate program is just advocating for, like, there's a couple different layers that I'm really trying to highlight. The most important one that I think is just highlighting that us Indigenous people do know how to manage for our world and for our more than human relatives in a way that is more effective, but it's also culturally responsive. It allows us to kind of practice our traditions, our land management techniques, and also it's intentional. It's an intricate way of also managing for our relatives. And the spring chinook salmon is the relative that I am most passionate about, just because of how dramatic and of a historical shift it has been in populations. Um, Extremely low numbers, like Keith was saying, 2% of the population is left. And so that's kind of what I've been doing, while also supporting that Indigenous knowledge perspective, where a lot of people kind of want to make way with the Indigenous knowledge term, just because it is a science, it is lifestyle that isn't just a way of knowing, but it's a way of living too. So I think that's something that I have within my work, and that is going to be kind of highlighted in the data collection that I will be offering. And so some of the issues that kind of come with why the spring chinook salmon numbers are so low is because there hasn't been really any environmental protection over them, despite a lot of continuous efforts from tribal entities, NOAA, or not NOAA, but like different organizations who really see this trend heading into a downward spiral, but they're kind of linking them in with, like, it gets really political and it gets really intense of a discussion on the genetic difference between the spring chinook and the fall chinook salmon, especially in the Klamath Trinity watershed. There's been a lot of efforts that have been kind of put back in fear that it would be kind of a floodgate kind of decision that might grant a lot of different protection throughout the globe. So there's been a lot of politics involved. But even though I think that there is things to be said about the protection part of things, that's barely what I'm trying to show here in my work. I'm more or less just trying to say, like, hey, we may not have 100,000 or 10,000 years worth of kind of written down evidence of us being um, scientists or biologists or all those things, but we do have connection through stories and connection through our practices of our religion that tell us, like, hey, we know what we have to do, and this is what we have to do when we have to do it. And so that's my primary focus, is just bringing up those local Indigenous voices to these decision management tables, for one, to satisfy their inherent responsibility to advocate and protect our relatives, and for two, just to kind of level, like, have that that representation at these tables. I think that's really important for our social health, our mental health, and the natural resources and kind of environmental health as well. So those are like the themes that I'm trying to highlight and the most passionate about. So yeah, and a lot of this is kind of backing off of Dr. Kari Norgard's work as far as like the nutritional health of access to traditional foods. And like Keith was saying, the river is basically our grocery store. Growing up in Sums Bar, closest grocery store you're going to get is probably like 50 miles away. And not to mention how expensive it is just based on that import export kind of factor of different items. So growing up on commodity foods, it's like there's a disproportionate amount of unhealthy kind of groceries, or even, if you can even call them that really sets the health of our people at a downward trajectory, opposed to being what I know. And like, I've heard stories from elders who um who lived to be like 109, and I'm just like, man, they must have had like a really prestige diet, and now I think the number that I heard is kind of like 55 if you're lucky, and so it's like, especially as a native man, it's like, it's pretty disheartening to think like, man, I'm already halfway through my life, but I know I'm breaking barriers. And I think that's a part of the work that I'm trying to do, is break the barriers that have kind of been systematically put on our plate. And that does start with practicing a healthy lifestyle, being engaged in your culture, but also being consistent with your nutrition and having that balance. Like, I wish I could say I live off of my traditional foods, but I can't really say that. Um, Although I do have some eels jarred up. I do have a sturgeon cut from my brother who he gifted me that just this last weekend. So there's definitely glimpses and tastes of it, which I'm very grateful for. I just know that there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's a lot of, all of this is interconnected. I think Keith was touching on that too. It's like, some in one hat, you're talking to some Western scientists where it's like a language. You gotta learn a different language of the different talk. And then you go back to your elders, and you kind of like gotta talk more locally, kind of talk a little bit more. And a lot of it's stories, a lot of it's histories, to where you're getting your point across. And so with that, there is a little bit of tension sometimes there's misunderstandings. But I know that it's important to have those conversations and to kind of be on the same page and get through those um, greater teachings. And it's just growing up in those type of spaces. It's hard for me to feel like I can't say that I've been living a perfect life lately. It's been really hard, with this pandemic and all these different things. It makes it really real. Like, man, if I could just live home, living off the land, a lot of these problems probably wouldn't arise, even though some would. But it's hard knowing that everyone's kind of going through it, and it just emphasizes like the disconnectedness for some people, like, especially being Karuk. You really don't have that much to do being out in Somes. You got your river, you got your outdoors for sure. You could be burning, it could be managing your land. But as far as like fishing, we don't really have a lot of rights to be managing for a reservation. Like, that's a big setback for us in a way. Like, we don't have a lot of jurisdiction to manage for our lands. And the Forest Service, as we all probably know, have been mismanaging our lands for 400 plus years. And that's why we're getting all these catastrophic fires. And that really does impact the fisheries, whether you know that or not, because the fires up in Happy Camp, took a trip up there a couple weekends ago to visit some family, and it was devastating. It made me want to kind of throw up in a way, just because I knew like how many lives were probably lost, like, especially um animals, and different riparian areas, different ecosystems that are gone. You know, there's, you could see straight up the hill and in not a good way, you know, and those, once the rain hits, you know, once we start getting some weather rolling, like it's just going to muck up the whole creek. It's going to, you know, blow out, and it's going to mess up with the, you know, water quality, and that's not really necessarily a good thing for our fisheries. So those things are just, it's just hard. It's a hard reality check to live, to wake up knowing like, man, another day, like what's going to happen today. And so I just, that's why it's really easy to kind of get lost in these academic spaces, is just because, you know, like, hey, this is my zone. Like I could do something with this. I could, no one could take this from me, you know, and that's what I try to aspire to do. But at the same time, you know, we are human. We all have our own kind of things that we're going through that prevents us from pursuing and achieving some of these things that we're trying to do to make this world a better place. But I think I just I just really appreciate when people are real about things, you know, because it could seem like people have everything they need to know or need to have to be living in a well balanced lifestyle, but sometimes you just never know who's kind of going through it, and just kind of break down that image of like everyone's doing well, because it's all right to not feel well. And that's what I've been telling myself, like it's all right to kind of be going through it. School's not everything, but at the same time, school can be an outlet to express yourself and also do what you have to do as kind of a native person. So that's kind of my talk today. So yeah, I think I'll pass it back over to Ketcha, and looking forward to some questions, and thank you.